Hey everyone, welcome back to Santa Cruz's #1 Google Slides show, I guess. Now, I'm re-recording now some of the greatest hits from the period of time in which I could not get the sound working on my computer for the life of me. And of those hits, undoubtedly the greatest, the slideshow you may have seen but never heard, is this one, Antiquity into Islam. I originally recorded this as a guest lecture for a class that was being taught by Camilo Gomez Rivas, one of my colleagues in the literature department, on the life of Muhammad and the Quran. Really good class, so if it ever gets taught again, I would recommend you take it. And what I'm doing here is talking about the connections between the Quran and the classical world. The Quran and the classical world. And for some reason, I've got this picture of a dang truck as the first slide here, and there's not really much I can do about that. But when you're talking about the Quran, there's really two ways you can talk about it. You can talk about it in terms of a collection of stories. Well, I mean, there's lots of ways you can talk about the Quran, but when you're talking about the connections between the Quran and the classical world, there are two ways to do it. You can think of it as a collection of stories about sort of known figures like Jesus, the prophets, etc. And the way those stories spin out are idiosyncratic but not totally cut loose from other sources. For instance, in the Quran, Jesus is crucified, but not successfully. He only appears to be crucified in order to fool all the people who are trying to crucify him. Instead, he's like sitting over in the corner and laughing at them. And he's fine. Now, this depiction of Jesus is obviously not identical to the canonical Christian one, but it does correspond to a Christian heresy called Doceticism, which was pretty popular in the 2nd through whenever centuries. It's one of the major enduring heterodox theologies of the crucifixion, and it shows up here in the Quran. On the other end of Jesus' life, you get a story of his birth, which involves a much more detailed account of the flight into Egypt. And some of those details seem to match up with some of the description given in the Protevangelium of James, the birth gospel of James. So you can imagine these stories moving about as a result of the late antique religious situation in Arabia, which modern research is showing is much more varied than people used to think. People used to think that Arabia before Muhammad was almost entirely polytheistic. This is the impression that the life of Muhammad gives, although the Quran is actually not super explicit about it. It refers to the people who are later identified as idolaters as kafirun, those who are ungrateful to God, but that doesn't mean you worship multiple gods, and mushrikun, those who make companions for God. But in a lot of situations where you can figure out what that means, it seems to be pointing pretty explicitly to Christians, that is, pointing toward the Trinity as a form of polytheism. Islam being very rigorously monotheistic. There are idols and idolaters mentioned in the Quran, but it seems like lots of other religions as well, implicitly as well as explicitly. The Quran mentions Christians, it mentions Jews. And there were a lot of Arabs who were Christian and Arabs who were Jewish, not necessarily the orthodox form of either of those, in Arabia in the couple centuries before Muhammad. So this is a sphere of religious contact. More interesting to me as a way of approaching the text, though, and tracing its connections to classical antiquity, is the language itself. As you probably know, the Quran is written in Arabic. You may not know that the Quran contains a number of fairly recognizable borrowings. These can be recognized because a pretty wide range of phonetic rules are followed rigorously in borrowings from Greek and Latin. For instance, the kappa in Greek manifests as a qaf, usually, in Arabic. So, for instance, you've got Greek kalamos, from which one gets Arabic kalam, meaning pen. Kalamos means reed originally, but it comes to mean pen by late antiquity. And so there are lots and lots of borrowings like that in the Quran that are recognizable. This is not to suggest that Muhammad borrowed these words himself from any of these neighboring languages, but rather, and I think this is a more interesting possibility, that Arabic itself at that point was already a metropolitan language. It was already at the center of flows of people, flows of culture connecting the Greek world, the Syriac-speaking worlds, Persia, and also North Africa. Most histories which are written from Western perspective, so all the Greek and Latin histories that talk about Arabia, before Muhammad, represented as a pretty marginal place, like a desert at the edge of the world. Got some choice incense and perfume and such that comes from there, but it's not kind of a crossroads of different cultures. Now, the range of foreign vocabulary that appears in the Quran shows that this is definitely not the case, that, in fact, Arabia, in late antiquity at least, has a pretty vibrant and well-connected culture. And that makes the Quran, say, a classical text itself, if for no other reason than because it's participating in dialogue with all of these classical texts and classical languages that people tend to recognize as classical without any kind of question. And also in the kind of broader religious discourse that connects the whole sort of late antique world, from Central Asia to Portugal. So let's talk about some of these borrowings that there are. You get a lot of borrowings which are words for kind of elite trade goods, luxury goods in particular. So a lot of these borrowings belong in the zone of material culture. You've got, for instance, yakut, ruby, which pretty clearly derives from Greek huakinthos. Istibrak is another one, derives from brocade. Not all of the material culture items that end up as borrowings are luxury goods. For instance, there is a reference to a very hot heat in the Quran, which is called at-tanur, the tanur, which likely comes from derives from contact with the Indian subcontinent. It is the tandoor oven which is being borrowed here. So in all of these cases, the name kind of travels with the thing. Rubies, brocade, tandoors, all of these items are moving around the world and the name follows with them. So the fact that these names are borrowed into Arabic helps us map these networks of trade and exchange as well as networks of cultural contact. And also lends support for the reputation of Mecca as a trade hub, which it has in the Sirah, the life of Muhammad, and a lot of early Islamic historiography as well. Now, when we're talking about items of material culture, there is one that is particularly important for locating the composition of the Quran, the revelation of the Quran. And that word is fulk. Fulk is the Quranic word for boat. This is interesting because it doesn't mean boat outside of the Quran. There are a bunch of other words, qarib, safina, various other words for boat, which are much more common. Fulk just means boat in the Quran. However, it is very clear in the Quran that it means boat in that context, because it's the thing that Noah rides the flood out on, so some kind of a boat. the solution to the puzzle of why the Quran features this unique word for boat that is not widely present in other classical Arabic texts actually also has to do with borrowing. There is a Greek word, epholkion. Epholkion is a kind of boat, but it's a kind of boat that only is used or exists on the Red Sea, which is immediately adjacent to the Arabian Peninsula. So, the fact that this Greek word for boat, epholkion, gets borrowed into folk and then shows up in the Quran, tells us something about where the Quran is coming from. It's got to be coming from a place that is near the Red Sea. It's on the Red Sea side of the Arabian Peninsula. And indeed, that is the tradition. Mecca and Medina are both pretty close to the Red Sea and participate in the land side of Red Sea trade. So in this respect, too, the borrowed vocabulary of the Quran tends to confirm something that we see in other Arabic sources about the composition of the Quran. Well, so some things are just things. Some material culture is just stuff. Others are a bit more ideologically central. In the kind of metaphorical language of Islam. And one of those is as-sirat al-mustaqim, a hugely important concept in the Quran and in the way that human progress through life is thought of in the Quran. It's thought of as a journey whereon you should stick to the straight path. The sirat al-mustaqim is the straight path. You got to watch out for the sirat al-udwan, which is the curvy path, because the devils live there and they're going to try to drag you off the straight road. And this metaphorics of going straight, knowing where you're going, being murshad, versus being dalun and wandering and being lost, runs throughout the Quran. It's one of the most important metaphors in the whole text. Well, sirat. Sirat means way, means road, path. And it is very probably a borrowing from Latin, in fact, from Latin via strata. Sirat. And of course we get our own English word street from that same etymon. Now, if you're on your toes about geography, and you think, hey, western part of the Roman Empire is Latin-speaking, eastern part is Greek-speaking, you might be thinking, how would a Latin term, a Latin word, make it all the way into Arabic? Seems like a long trip to take. Well, it seems like the transmission actually goes through Greek, which borrows it from Latin first as a term in Roman law, as a legal or property term. So the Greeks import the concept of a street along with the word and its value and meaning in Roman law. And we actually we know of a case in pre-Islamic Arabia where there is something referred to as a strata, which is the subject of a property dispute, a legal dispute. There is a sheep run, a street along which sheep go, or a sheep migration path, I suppose, which has traditionally been the property of Harith, who is an Arab king and an ally of the Romans. And the Romans confirm his right to it. So we see the legal utility of having this term, sirat, which just corresponds directly to Roman strata. So this central religious metaphor, I won't say comes from the sort of Roman imperial material culture, but definitely appropriates it and uses it as an image for the straight and narrow path on which people need to stay. Now we can talk about material culture in a slightly broader sense too. Like, not all material culture is stuff that exists, or at least stuff that we, as modern people, think exists. Take, for example, hell. Hell. Well, we think it's pretty fake, mostly, for the most part, but for a lot of people in the ancient world, and actually probably for the majority of Americans, even up until fairly recently, hell was real, and a real place that existed in some relation to the world in which we lived. So this is a kind of material culture. It's just, we wouldn't think of it as material culture because we don't think it exists, but it was that for the first generations of Muslims, for sure, something that was real. Now, the Quranic word for hell looks a little strange from the perspective of Arabic linguistics. There are several words for hell, but I'm just going to talk about one of them now. Jahannam is the one with the most consonants and the ones from which the others are derived. All these guys over here are derived from Jahannam. And that's one more consonant than Gehenna has, the normal Christian word. Standard Arabic lexical items have 3 consonants. So 4 consonant items are at least under suspicion of being borrowings, though they are not always. So where does the extra M come from? From Hebrew and Syriac, Gehenna, to Jahannam in Arabic. The intermediary here, where the extra M comes from, is Gaz, which is the ancient language and still the liturgical language of Ethiopia. It wasn't called Ethiopia then, but the kingdom of the Negush, or Aksum. Gaz spells hell that way. It puts the M on it. And now if you take a look at a map, you'll see that Ethiopia and the Red Sea side of the Arabian Peninsula, that is the Hijaz, are fairly close. These two places are separated by water, but in the ancient world, water can unite more than it divides. It's a lot faster to get across a body of water than it is to travel on land, because you can use the wind to drive your boat and all that. And there is quite a lot of, I guess we might euphemistically say, interaction between both sides of the Red Sea in the 6th century CE. So Ethiopia invades a couple of times the Arabian Peninsula. Despite this, let's say, apparent military hostility, there is a story that Muslims depart on a so-called first hijrah, before the one that involves them going from Mecca to Medina. They flee Mecca for Ethiopia. The Negus, the king of the Habasha, the Ethiopians, is a Christian and very tolerant of monotheists. So they find a good reception there, and there's this kind of story where they manage to convert the king too before they have to go home. But at any rate, the borrowing of words like Jahannam, which is not the only borrowing from Gaz in the Quran, points to a much more significant traffic between these two places, the movement of culture as well. The Arabic language ends up picking up all of these cultural loose ends and tying them together, and the texture of Quranic discourse results from that. And speaking of the texture of Quranic discourse, I did save the spiciest example for last. An item of the Quranic lexicon that's way more central even than sirat. And that's din, which is an Arabic word which you might know, even if you don't know any Arabic, because it is often sort of left untranslated in sort of works about Islam or the Arabic-speaking world. Din is actually the component of a whole bunch of personal names, including Alauddin or Aladdin, and so it might also be known to you from there. In those names and elsewhere in the Quran, most places in the Quran, Din means religion. Means religion and usually Islam. It also has this other meaning in the phrase Yawmuddin, the day of judgment, the apocalypse. Now, it's not totally clear how these two meanings are related to one another, religion and the divine judgment, but it turns out that basically they're not. Both meanings are borrowed. So Arabic has the root dal ya nun, three-letter root, which means owe, as in owe a debt. And it does sometimes show up in the Quran in the word dain, which means debt. It's not obviously related, again, to either of the two above meanings. The day of judgment meaning probably comes in from Syriac or Aramaic, because din in those languages means judgment, like the thing that a judge does, and it is definitely also a scriptural term to describe divine judgment. So it probably comes into Arabic via the use of Arabic by Christians to conduct religious ritual and rites. Which means Muhammad is not the first person to talk about the apocalypse in Arabic, though he certainly puts his own spin on it. What about that other meaning? Now, this idea of deen as religion is actually a real conceptual development in Islam, a new thing that didn't really exist in antiquity. The idea of a religion as such, a religion where, like, I can have a religion, you can have a religion, there are all sorts of religions in the world, doesn't exist in Greek and Latin antiquity. There are various forms of belief and faith, but generally the people who use this word like faith or belief to describe what they believe in will not use the same word to describe what other people believe in. So the idea of multiple religions doesn't really get into the ancient world. But in the Quran, there's this famous phrase, Lakum dinukum waliya din. You have your deen, I have my deen. You have your religion, I have mine. There can be many religions. Though, of course, Islam is the true one. There are many religions out there. So where does that sense get into the word deen? Well, in that sense, it appears to be a borrowing from Persian. There is an Avestan word, daena, which refers to a kind of soul that people have. People have a bunch of different souls in Zoroastrianism. But dain, in Middle Persian, comes to mean practices which are good for the soul. So dain is, let's say, the Persian word for Zoroastrianism. It's a way that they refer to their own religion. So is that where it comes from in Arabic, in the Quran? There is a lot of Persian influence in Arabia. Parts of the Arabian Peninsula, Oman, for instance, are occupied by the Persians during late antiquity. There are Persians, like Salman, for instance, who show up in the biography of the Prophet. But there is one important difference between the way that dain is used in Middle Persian and the way that it's used in Quranic Arabic. In Middle Persian texts that are Zoroastrian, dain is only used to refer to Zoroastrianism. Other religions are called by different and more derogatory words. Kesh, it's kind of a superstition, or a waraishin, a mere belief, an opinion. But, like I said, in the Quran, deen can be used for Islam as well as all the other religions that are around and about. The missing link here between Zoroastrian dain and Quranic deen may be the way that the word is used by Manichaeans. Manichaeans, I'm going to point you back to the long video I did on them. if you're interested. The Manichaeans are a religious movement that everyone basically hates but can't really stamp out. They're very big in Persia, very big in the Near East, big in Central Asia. And they inherit a lot of religious vocabulary from Zoroastrianism because a lot of the say scriptural texts of Manichaeanism circulate in Middle Persian translations. They were originally written in Syriac, but the Syriac versions are mostly lost. The Middle Persian ones seem to have been way more popular because more people could read them. And in those texts, Mani uses the word Dain to describe any religion. He says, my Dain is the best for all of these reasons. He says it's alive, that makes it best. Also, dead people have been saved by posthumously converting to it, that makes it best. But there are all these other Dain, other Denan, which also exist in history. So he's also using Dain in this way that looks a little bit like the way that it's used in the Quran, which is to say, as a way of comparing things that are the same. So, kind of want to think that Din comes into Arabic from Persian in this meaning, possibly via a Manichaean route, though in the nature of Manichaeanism as a religion that tends to hide since it's constantly being persecuted, it'd be a little difficult to discover what that route was. So what we're seeing here is that many of the pieces out of which the Quran is made, a lot of the words, are old. They belong to the classical worlds in the sense that they were borrowed from classical languages and older literary traditions. But the whole that they turn into is something totally new, this kind of Voltron that's more than the sum of its lions. Is the sum of many different intersecting classical discourses, trade routes, material cultures, religious conversations. And as, let's say, the receptacle of all of this stuff, the crossing point of all of this stuff, the Arabic language is a great place to write a religious text that is in a position to master all of these religious discourses. And so one way of understanding the Quran's immense appeal to all sorts of people in late antiquity is exactly the way that it's connected to all of these different cultures and practices that extend way beyond Arabia itself. It's hooked into the entire ancient world. Not just the Mediterranean, but also the East in Persia and India. It's really at the center of all that. And well, that is all about all I have to say about that. But I hope that you will join me again next week for, say, probably something new. That we'll be coming back to these greatest hits from time to time.